Good morning, good afternoon. We are very happy to welcome you all to our annual Russian Donors Forum. It's an extremely important event to all of us. In just a couple more minutes, we'll start our first opening session. But before we start, I would like to thank all those who support us, who regularly participate in our activities, members of the Russian Donors Forum, our general partners, Sakhalin Energy, SUAC, Philip Morris, and the X5 Retail Group, which is our partner for this day in particular. And our moderator today is Daria Kalenbet, our program director. Hello, Daria. Yes, Alexander, thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm extremely happy to see all of you. This is day 2 of our annual conference, and we start with a very important session. This is our international session. We'll talk about philanthropy in BRICS countries in achieving sustainable development goals. Sustainability has always featured prominently on our agenda. For example, last year, exactly 1 year ago in September, we had a special event with the UN. We also work closely with the Daphne in Europe. We work with the CECP. We always do our best to stay in touch with our international colleagues and learn from them. In the last couple of years, one of the top priorities for our international activities was research that we did on philanthropy in BRICS countries, because Russia has a lot in common with BRICS countries. We are very close in terms of social structure, territory, and we felt like many of the challenges we face in Russia are quite similar to what happens in other BRICS countries. We have a lot in common. So I'm happy that we are joined today by our wonderful colleagues from all over the globe. We have Priya Naik of Samhita Ventures. They have been working with the Donors Forum, Russian Donors Forum, for a few years now, and so we can learn about India. We are also joined by Cathy, Duff, director of Trialogue, South Africa. We are happy to see Cathy today. Trialogue publishes a wonderful annual report. We use it quite a bit to learn about the business and its contribution in developing the corporate social responsibility sector in South Africa, including in achieving SDG goals. And we're also joined by Cassio, CEO of GIFE. GIFE is actually very similar to what the Russian Donors Forum does in Russia. They do the same thing in Brazil. So we are happy to see Cassio today. And we are also joined by Yurii Blagov. We love this partner. He's the head of the CSR Center at St. Petersburg University. We have been working together on one of my favorite projects on SDG in Russia. All right. First of all, let me say a few words by way of opening remarks. In recent years, We did some research on philanthropy and social responsibility in BRICS countries, and simultaneously we developed particular interest in sustainability, because we feel like the philanthropy sector can play an even bigger role in terms of the 2030 agenda. And we also think that the SDGs is a wonderful lingua franca, common language, a common platform which can be used for the public sector, private sector, and the NGO sector, all working together. So because of that, we decided we would do a little review to see how the philanthropy and social investment sector works on the 2030 agenda, on sustainability goals in their respective countries. Very soon we'll publish this review, this report, and we are very grateful to our partners from other BRICS countries who helped us to prepare this report. They helped us with data reporting on the situation in their respective countries. And we haven't published the full text of this report yet, but today I'll give you a foretaste, and I will share some of the key trends that we saw as we did this research. So let me briefly mention a few points. Number one, I'm a hopeless optimist. So the first thing I want to mention is that the level of engagement has been steadily growing across all BRICS countries. There are three factors here that define the level of awareness and maturity. Number one, the role of the government. There are countries where the government clearly is quite active in working on SDG goals. So in those countries, SDG agenda is making good progress. Also, international development institutions like the UN Development Program, Compact, the UN Global Compact Network, these are all institutions that really promote the 2030 agenda, play a big role. And third, our sector is special, and it is important how big the corporate component of the sector is. Based on our research, based on the data we collected, if the corporate component is strong, corporate foundations, if there are big companies advancing their SDG agenda, this trickles over, this strengthens the philanthropy sector and its contribution to SDGs. Speaking of corporations, we can say that it is companies, businesses who play the most active role in advancing the SDGs. And it is easy to understand why, because companies, they are interested in developing this agenda because they want to present this in their reporting. And this is an important ESG factor for companies. At this point, we're not sure how the ESG matters correlate with the SDG agenda. But on the whole, we can say that ESG plays a positive role. We did a few in-depth interviews to see how SDGs work in BRICS countries. And I can say there is a kind of consensus in the donor community. More or less everybody agrees that the SDGs provide a convenient framework, a common platform where we can all interact and work together productively. But at the same time, I have to mention that at the current stage, the SDG is primarily limited to the elite level of players, and they mostly do this for the purposes of their external relations. Still, we're fully optimistic about the prospects. Okay, one more key trend that we were able to identify. Unfortunately, stakeholders do not use SDGs often to set up targets, to plan their activities. What happens is mostly they use their existing programs and they try to find some SDG elements in what they already have been doing, and then they just mention this in their reporting rather than planning their activities with the SDG goals in mind from the very beginning. We started doing this report back in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic was in full swing. So we also did some research on how the pandemic affected the sustainability agenda. On the one hand, we could say that COVID-19 made it clear that it is important to intensify our work on sustainable development goals. At the same time, I have to say we saw some setbacks in the SDG agenda because of the pandemic, so now we'll have some catching up to do. Okay, one more point. When we did these in-depth interviews, all of the respondents told us they see need for coordinated work between different players in society. These players should not just come together based on their, I don't know, goodwill or some impulse. No, this should be structured. This should be coordinated. There should be some kind of institution bringing all the stakeholders together and helping them work together. And one more point, they mentioned that there is not enough transparency in SDG matters. This is another thing everybody talked about. But this is a pretty common problem. This does not apply to SDG alone. This is a common problem for the philanthropy and social investment sector. We often talk about the lack of transparency. And one more interesting point that BRICS countries have in common is that the situation is very different within one country, in different parts of the country, in different regions. Because, like I said, BRICS countries are quite similar, but they all have this feature that inside the country there are different parts, different provinces, and there are pretty substantial differences between those provinces. There are provinces where SDG goals and the awareness level is quite high and the agenda is very prominent. And then there are other provinces where the situation is very different. So anyway, these are the features that BRICS countries have in common. This is what we found out in our analysis, in our review. And we also identified some unique features about each of the BRICS countries, but I will let our international speakers speak about their countries. So I think it's okay. We can now move on to our international speakers. So first of all, I turn to Priya. Just a second here. My first question is for Priya. Priya, in India, the government plays a pretty big role in promoting the sustainability agenda. For example, you have a special institute, you have the National Transformation Institute that does a lot of work in this field. And when we did our study, we were very impressed with your transparency level. It's very easy to find out what you're doing with SDGs. A lot of information is available. But in one of the interviews we did with you, you mentioned the lack of coordination. And you said you wish there would be a single coordinator to make this work better coordinated. So can you please elaborate? What do you think is lacking, given that the government helps you a lot?
Thank you, Daria. And I actually, thank you for having me here. And I completely agree with a lot of what you said in your initial presentation. Now, India, very similar to every other BRICS country, is very complex. It's very diverse, as you can imagine, that across the country, different regions have different levels of progress and priorities. And to your point, the government has set up this nodal agency called the NITI Aayog, and they sit in the middle of the public sector, the private sector, the philanthropic ecosystem, people's movements. And what they have done an outstanding job of is attempting to bring this diverse set of communities together and aligning it to the SDGs. So, for example, they have identified some of India's poorest districts. These are called the aspirational districts. And the programming around the aspirational districts is all aligned to the SDG framework, right? So the fact that the central government nodal agency is really using the SDGs as a key mechanism to evaluate progress and build alignment is very, very powerful. A few sort of positive things before I go to the challenges and opportunities. I think what's fantastic is that because of the CSR regulation in India, most companies, if not all, also use SDGs as a way to align their programming and measure their outcomes and goals. The NGOs do the same thing. The philanthropic organizations are doing the same thing. And even if you talk to the common man, the more educated, more aware common man, I think the SDGs are part of a common parlance, right? So the fact that all of your key stakeholders are aligning your goals and objectives and activities around the SDGs, very powerful. What's missing really is, I think, like you said, the ability for, and it doesn't have to be one central coordinating agency, right? But a series of central coordinating agencies. But there are a few things that are imperative. One, like you said, that the agency needs to inspire trust. The private, the public, the philanthropy ecosystem, the public in general, right, have to trust that this organization has the best interests of not just the country, but each of the stakeholders in mind. And they have to necessarily build win-win collaborations, given that perspectives are different, resources and priorities are different. So there's a few successes that we've really seen. One, we're seeing a lot of innovation around the SDGs, bringing these diverse set of stakeholders together. Second, we're seeing a lot of interest in blended finance, right? So the ability to bring together the public, private, financial sector to really create large-scale goals. The third thing that we're seeing is just large-scale collaboratives. And I'll just give you an example of one collaborative that we've created that's seeing a lot of success. So as a response to the pandemic, a key priority for India was, how do you take a large proportion of the informal workers and micro entrepreneurs that form the backbone of the Indian economy? And this is true of every single country in the world. And how do you get them not just to recover, but to stay resilient and prosper in this new economy? And so the first thing that we did is we created a collaborative called Revive. The aim is to irreversibly increase incomes of 10 million workers and entrepreneurs. Why workers and entrepreneurs? Without them, the economy doesn't succeed. Why income? That's what they care about. Why irreversible? Because they go through a crisis every day of their lives and they have to prosper. So the fact that it was aligned to a key national and societal priority was fantastic. Second, it's aligned to every single government scheme for workers and entrepreneurs. Third, these 10 people are actually part of the corporate ecosystem, which is why we're seeing a lot of participation from the private sector who are interested in supporting their workforce, their micro entrepreneurs, people in their communities. It was completely aligned with a lot of the work that NGOs and the common man was doing. So today, Revive uses 6 interventions, right? So we do access to blended finance, which means we're really unlocking a lot of the financial resources that the country has to offer to underserved communities. We're ensuring that all 10 million people actually get access to government schemes. So great alignment with government priorities. We're ensuring that all 10 million people are digitally empowered citizens and their businesses are thriving because of digital transformation. India, very similar to every other country, has a big focus on digital transformation and inclusion. We're ensuring that everyone has the skills to succeed in the new economy. We're ensuring market linkages. We're ensuring investments in health, sanitation, hygiene, which are integral for women to participate and succeed in the workforce. So a collective that's actually built in partnership with private public philanthropy ecosystem and people's movements that creates win-win solutions, not just for the country, but also for all of the stakeholders. And I think what's fantastic about some of the work that we're seeing in India and the one that we're doing is this is not unique to India, right? The 6 interventions I talk about are relevant to Brazil and South Africa and Russia and every other country. And therefore, these are highly replicable solutions that can be contextualized. So Daria, I just want to end with what you said, right? You said you're a hopeless optimist, and so am I. I think, at least in the country that I'm sitting in, I'm seeing a lot of alignment, a lot of excitement. The question really is 2 things. How do you create a sense of urgency? How do you go from a program mindset to almost a movement, a mission mode, so that you're able to gather the largest number of players to collectively achieve a very, very significant national priority, right? And the second is, what does this coordination look like? Who is that agency that everyone trusts, that everyone believes is optimizing not just for the common good, but for each individual stakeholder's priorities and responsibilities? And we're seeing so much movement around that front that I'm very optimistic that we can do this not just in India, but also partner with all of you and everyone else who's listening to see how we can contextualize it in your countries, because really I think the problems that we face and the solutions that we encounter are so similar. Thank you.
Большое спасибо, Priya.
Thank you very much, Priya. That was indeed very inspiring to listen to you. I'm happy that in different parts of the world, there are hopeless optimists like myself, and it gives us hope. I have a question for you, brief one. Would you tell me, based on how your international development institutions work, what do you think they play in India, such organizations, and how strong is their influence today compared, let's say, a few years before?
Yeah, so Revive, the Alliance for the 10 Million Workers and Entrepreneurs that I talked about, is funded by the US government, the British High Commission, UNDP, Omidyar Network, MSDF. So a lot of global foundations, including Google, Microsoft, LinkedIn, right? So I think India offers 2 opportunities. One, the fact that there is so much innovation at scale is very empowering for a lot of the international organizations when they fund efforts like ours. Having said that, there is a lot of regulatory changes which are reducing systematically the influence that foreign players can play in our countries. But even without, that very severe restriction, I think what's fantastic is that we find that a lot of international foundations are catalytic in their approach, right? They don't have a programmatic mindset. They're really saying, how do we bring these various stakeholders together? How do we catalyze a lot more resources from public and financial markets? How do we get philanthropy to be more vibrant? So the fact that they are really leveraging their global experience, right? They're working in all of these other countries, and they're able to bring that to bear in a country like India and learn and share and sort of grow as a result of that is really truly outstanding. The question really is, A, how do each of us as sort of, national players make the most of the fact that we have these common relationships with a set of international players who have a much broader view compared to each of us, right? So how do we leverage each other, but their network and their expertise and their resources to not just ensure progress in our countries, but do it collectively and globally? But again, I think, we find that they're outstanding partners. So I'm really excited about, how forums such as these can deepen some of those partnerships with international agencies, even knowing that all of our individual countries are restricting their influence for various reasons.
Спасибо,
Thank
Priya.
you very much, Priya. I'm really excited by your comprehensive and strategic approach that you've taken in working on all this. And I think it is very important that you do that. Thank you so much. I wonder if my colleagues have any questions. We have about 1 minute to ask Priya a question or two. I don't think there are any questions right now, but I think that we can move on to another part of the world and talk to Cassio França. Cassio, when we talk about Brazil, the first that comes to my mind, especially after we've done our overview, is how incredibly active and mindful your civil society is in your country, in a similar way as it is the case in the Brazil civil society, which is in the vanguard of sustainable development and drives this agenda. We have similar challenges. Do you think that these two important actors, are they enough in your work, or do you need some state stimulus packages, the government's help, in order to pay more attention to sustainable development goals?
So I'll start saying thank you very much for Russian donors annual conference. Thank you very much for inviting us. I'm very excited to be with India, South Africa, Russia, and Brazil together. I think this coalition BRICS, it's very important for the world. I'm thinking about the world. The world cannot go on without this kind of coalition. We have to think another way to try to help the world. In this way that we are today, I think the things we'll have less progress than we can if the BRICS coalition will have, it's more stronger than today. So it's very important to be together with us, with you. Thank you very much. So when you talk about civil society organization in Brazil, I think we are very proud of our civil society organizations. We consider, and the philanthropy in Brazil also consider, that civil society organization it's very important part of the democracy in Brazil. There is no democracy in Brazil without civil society organization strong. That's the point, and we are very proud of it. The data that I bring today to show you, it's part of a monitoring of civil society organization in Brazil. All of this data is public data, but the civil society organization, they put it together, and every year we have kind of this report that I want to show just some points for you. If you can, Daria, please put the presentation. We have some data to show you. This is, well, just Amazon a picture for you. The next one, so about GIFE, it's except that you explain it. Yeah, the next slides, yes. About GIFE, that's the next slide. Yeah, it's exactly what you mentioned in your presentation. It's a philanthropy platform. Today we are 160 members together. And we when we see the global goals, and we go to the next slide, and we can see the civil society working group for the next slide, please, Daria. Yeah. The civil society working group for the 2030 agenda. So these data are the results of 100 civil society experts, 50 organizations working together to monitoring the SDG agenda. And the conclusion is in the next agenda, and is in the next slide, is that unfortunately, you can put the next slide, please. I can say that's the conclusion. The conclusion is deeply concerned today. We evaluated 168 targets originally applicable to the country, including 7 considered as not applicable. And we can see now that there was no available data for 4.76. 11 targets remained or became standard. 14 were at risk. 24 saw insufficient progress, increasing from 30 previous years. You can see in the last year, we had 30 targets that we saw insufficient progress. Now we have 24, and while we had setback in 110 targets. It means that 8% didn't make progress in Brazil, and 14 we have only insufficient progress. That's the picture today. And you can see in the next slide, I know that's very, we cannot read, but just to show that we're monitoring all of them. And if it's at risk, it's insufficient, or we have the progress. And 168 targets, we have just one that we have good progress. And I just want to put some figure into SDG goals. The next slide we can see. So this is all of the targets. That's it. We can see here that hunger in this SDG, zero hunger, since 2013, we can see that we have severe insecurity. This is the evolution of food security, and we can see the hunger in Brazil. It's going up. It's severe insecurity. This is the last point here. It's 15 here today, and since 2013, it's growing, the hunger in Brazil. And we are going down in the alimentary security for most of our people here in Brazil. So, and if still when you talk about hunger, in the next slides, we can see that Brazil is still a racist country, because if you put the structural racial and inequalities of Brazilian society are starkly visible when hunger is viewed as a map. You can see that no white people, they have more hunger than white people in Brazil. Serious food insecurity. You can see both of the datas. So you can see the orange one, it's bigger than the white one. And this is, we are putting the ration data for UC. So we have more hunger in Brazil since 2013, and we have still the ration points. That's it's very, we are very worried about that. The next one is the last one. I want to talk about climate action, and we can see the disasters in Brazil, environment disasters in Brazil. It's growing since 2013 and so on. This is the last. Yeah, that's the last slide. We don't have too much time here, but I brought two examples, hunger and climate disasters, just to concretely show for you that since the last 8 years, our situation is worse when we are talking about SDG agenda. This is the civil society monitoring. And the point in this, it's important to say that since 2013, we have a political situation very hard in Brazil, and the philanthropic sector, we are not strong enough to put some breaks in these kind of things. You know, this government sector is very strong, as you said in the beginning. It's true in Brazil. It's true in our country. Brazil is a continental country. So the role of the government, it's very important role. And without this and we are not strong enough to put some breaks in this. The situation is very hard. We are having a general election today. And if the next president, if he's not in favor of SDG agenda, the philanthropic sector can do almost nothing, because we cannot replace governments. We just have to work with the government. We will never replace the government. So the situation that I want to show that philanthropic sector is very important, but we have a hard limitation to reverse this kind of setback that we have here in Brazil today. I think that's the message. And just to finalize it, that's civil society organization. I think that without strong civil society organization, it would be worse, because neither this kind of data we could show to you in this forum today. So I think we are very proud of civil society organization in Brazil, but the political situation, and it's part of the change. And we have to work together, but we have to feel the whole picture, not just our philanthropic sector. So we have to have some tools to put more effort in our governments to push these changes in the direction that we want. That's it. Sorry for being so long time working.
Большое спасибо, Cassio.
Thank you very much, Cassio. Thank you very much for demonstrating us the data that you've shown us. This is indeed very interesting. I had never seen this report that you just presented on this slide, and I would really be happy to read it in more detail and provide it to other participants of the conference for them to take a look at this. Amazingly, you spoke in your introductory remarks, and we discussed with Priya that the transparency of data and openness and availability of data is very important for us to ensure that we show it not just to the stakeholders who understand already what needs to be done, but also to those who may not be as aware of what the current problems are. And we can demonstrate this importance by using the language of numbers, how important it is to coordinate our efforts. You mentioned that the civil society is not all-powerful, and of course the government's involvement is very important for pushing the SDG agenda. Maybe in this context we should find a source or a resource that would allow us to join our efforts with the private sector, with the international development institutions to become more visible, a visible force for the government. We've spoken many times that the business community is very interested in achieving the SDGs, and maybe the force of the business community can be very useful here. What do you think about this proposal?
I agree with you, Daria. We tried to make this kind of coalition in Brazil with civil society organization and the companies. At GIFE, we have 60% of GIFE. It's linked with the corporations, or it's the institute of foundation of the corporations and the companies. And we also have companies. It's parts of the GIFE. It's true. It's the corporation agenda is very important. But as you said, maybe the target of SDG, it's not in the beginning of the strategic planning. They try to mention it, to link it before to have some strategies. So I don't know why. We have to understand better why it's not a target for the companies. It's not a target of most of the countries. And the corporation, I think if SDG the new agenda for them, like environment, ESG agenda now, maybe we have more, they can be more inspired to take this agenda. Otherwise, it will be also important, but I think we didn't put it in their agenda in day-by-day decisions. You know, I'm not very optimistic in this with the role of the companies for SDG agenda. I know that they have an important role, but the profits still are one of the most important points for them. They're trying to do SDG agenda and SDG agenda putting together, but I think we have more time to develop it. We need more time, maybe in the next 5 years, we can see it clearly. Today, I'm not very safe. I'm not secure that we put both agendas together, SDG and SDG agenda for the companies. That's, I think. We are in work in progress.
Great. Cassio, thank you very much. We just hope that we hope that the situation in Brazil improves and that you're able to make progress soon. Maybe through international cooperation. Since we started talking about business, I would like to turn to Cathy Duff now. Cathy, you work primarily with businesses, socially responsible businesses in South Africa. The fact that it is business, companies, corporations that are in the vanguard of the SDG agenda in South Africa, it's very good, but this is not what I was going to ask you about. When picking partners, what do businesses in South Africa pay attention to? Is it just pragmatic considerations, or they're also interested in working with, partnering up with, I don't know, international partners? Do they consider SDG matters when they pick partners?
Thank you, Daria. And thank you to the Russian Donors Forum for the invitation to be on this panel today. It's been very interesting to listen to colleagues from across the globe. And also thank you to the Russian Donors Forum for the research that you do on philanthropy in the BRICS countries. I know this is the second round of research that you're doing, and we always find it very interesting to compare South Africa to the other BRICS countries. So before answering your specific question, I just want to give a little bit of an overview of the situation of philanthropy, and particularly corporate philanthropy in South Africa. So South Africa, and I think unlike some of the findings in your research report, has a very long history of corporate philanthropic activity. And this goes back more than 100 years. During the years of apartheid, corporate philanthropy was strong, and most of that was focused on supporting the fight against the unjust system, and also on welfare issues such as health and education, specifically for the Black population. Then with the advent of democracy in South Africa was one of the first countries to regulate corporate social investment. So in 2003, there was a law introduced called the Black Economic Empowerment Law. And this actually, or the Black Economic Empowerment Act, and this requires that, amongst other things, it has many legs to it, but one of the things that it requires is that large companies give 1% of their profits after tax to socioeconomic development. So although companies were giving before, this regulation states an amount that they need to give, and it ensures that all large companies are investing in social causes. At Trialogue, as you mentioned in your introduction, we do annual research on the scope of this social investment by companies, and we estimate that over 10 billion of South African rands is spent by companies on social causes. This is equivalent to about almost 600 million US dollars annually. We have seen this amount decrease in the last year in our research, largely due to COVID. And the reason for this, as I mentioned, the Act requires companies to give a percentage of net profit after tax. And in 2020, with the onset of COVID, most companies saw a decrease in profits. And so we've then seen a decrease in social investment from companies. On the positive side, there's been an uptick last year in corporate profits. I think they were mostly worst affected in 2020. So we are expecting social investment to increase again. Just in terms of what causes are most popular in South Africa, almost all companies, so over 90% of them, invest in education causes. And although the South African government invests heavily in education, there are real issues with quality. And when you look at South Africa's educational results compared to other developing and undeveloped countries, they're not very good. So almost all companies invest in that. And around, we estimated that last year, almost 40% of total corporate social investment went into education. This is actually down from previous years, and the main reason being COVID again. And Cassio mentioned that in Brazil, hunger has gone up, and that's true in South Africa too. And this was particularly the case during COVID. We saw hunger levels increase significantly. There's a very large government school feeding program in South Africa. And when lockdown happened, this school feeding program actually closed down. And often it was for almost 10 million children, the only meal of the day that they would get. And with that closing down, we've seen hunger levels increase significantly. So we saw a shift in corporate expenditure in the last 2 years towards food security, which hadn't been a big focus area for companies before, and also towards disaster relief. So we've seen a direct shift in what companies are focusing on based on the impacts of the pandemic. And then you spoke about partners. And for companies, the most popular partners for their social investments are nonprofit organizations or civil society. So over 80% of companies do their social investment through companies. Through nonprofit organizations. I just want to talk, now I'll get more directly to the SDGs and to your question. So interestingly, South Africa had been through a years-long process and developed its own 2030 vision and accompanying national development plan. This was launched in 2012, which was actually prior to the launch of the SDGs in 2015. But that national development plan is very closely aligned to the 2030 agenda. So the national development plan prioritizes the elimination of poverty, the reduction of inequality, which is a huge issue in South Africa, and an inclusive economy. So the NDP goals are aligned to the SDGs and to the African Union agenda. So the African Union has a vision for 2063. So those are the three primary frameworks that the government is using: the National Development Plan, the African Union agenda, and the SDGs. And because of all these different frameworks, I guess, and different indicators and goals, there is a national coordinating mechanism that's been established for the national engagements and reporting on the 2030 agenda, the African Union agenda, the Southern African Development Community agenda, and the National Local South African Development Plan. So there's four different frameworks that the government is using. And like India, I think the government really is the key driver of the SDGs in South Africa. I guess unlike Brazil, progress has been made in a few areas on the SDGs. So particularly around access. So there's been increased access to water, to electricity, to sanitation, and to education and health. So more people can access all of those services, which is a positive. On the flip side of that, there's still an issue, as I mentioned, with education, with the quality of those services. So progress has also been made on gender equality in South Africa, and we've got some quite progressive regulations and some good progress made. However, major challenges remain, and we're still behind on many of the SDG goals. Top amongst those is persistently high levels of inequality, SDG 10. I think South Africa is now the most unequal country in the world. In others, our extremely high levels of violence against women and femicide. The other is, and again, Cassio spoke to the environment and climate change in Brazil. South Africa has big challenges here because South Africa relies predominantly on coal for its energy. And so the climate change goals are also lagging. So again, I believe that the government is the main driver of the SDGs in South Africa, but businesses play a significant role too. And most businesses do talk about the SDGs. And there is actually a membership body in South Africa called the Global Compact Network of South Africa, which works with companies, and it's a membership-based organization. It works with companies, nonprofit organizations, UN agencies, to advance both the 17 SDGs, but also the 10 UN Global Compact principles. So it provides tools and case studies, and there's a lot of information and examples of South African companies and how they're implementing the SDGs that you can find on the Global Compact Network of South Africa's website. As part of our research, we actually ask large companies each year about their implementation of the SDGs and their alignment to them. And last year, and this comes to the point you made that most organizations, philanthropic organizations, are not using the SDGs in their planning. Well, 77% of the companies that we surveyed said that they're using the SDGs in their social investment strategies. So that's been a positive development, that most of them are claiming, at least, to use them in their strategy development rather than just retrofitting them to their existing programs. I do think, given the vast range of the SDGs and the indicators, a lot of them do retrofit them to their existing programs, but at least they are considering them in their strategies. It's slightly less percentage than are considering the National Development Plan, which I spoke to earlier. So the first port of call is still the South African National Vision 2030. We also asked companies how they're implementing the SDGs into their overall organizational strategy. And 59% of companies claimed that the SDGs were integrated into their overall organizational strategy, which is quite a high number. And we then asked them about the 17 SDGs and which they aligned with. And on average, they claim to align with just over 6 of the 17 SDGs. The most popular, I guess, was SDG 4, or quality education. 88% of the companies we surveyed said they aligned with that one, particularly in their social investment work. And 67% aligned with SDG 3 around good health and well-being. So those were the most kind of popular SDGs for the social investment. The least supported by companies were SDG 15, which is life on land, SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, and SDG 14, life below water. So it was interesting just to see how companies are aligning their social investments to the different SDGs. But to try and get a sense of whether they're really aligning them, or whether they are, as you said, kind of retrofitting and just their existing programs, we asked them whether they actually use the 247 indicators in the SDG Global Indicator Framework to measure their programs. And over half of the companies said that they don't use that SDG indicator framework at all. 32% of the companies, which is about a third of them, said that they do use them for some projects, which I think is encouraging. And it showed the deeper level of engagement with the SDGs, actually going down to that indicator level. So overall, I'd say the adoption of the SDGs by South African companies is very high, and you mentioned that up front. I don't think they're necessarily selecting their partners based on SDG alignment, but they are increasingly using the SDGs in their strategy development, and a number of them are in fact using the SDG indicators when they measure their programs, in which case they'll obviously need to work with their nonprofit partners on those measures. As I mentioned, there's national coordinating mechanisms in South Africa for the SDGs and our local and continental plans and goals. And there's also membership organizations for companies that offers them support in implementing the SDGs. So at Trialogue, we haven't done specific research on private philanthropists and foundations, but my hypothesis is that the SDGs are less widely adopted by these organizations. Many of them have a much narrower focus than the corporates, and no real kind of incentive, I guess, to align to that SDG. They're not included in those membership organizational bodies that I spoke to. So thanks. Yeah, that's the overview on kind of corporate social investment in South Africa and our SDG situation.
Спасибо большое, Кэти. Это очень любопытно, что...
Thanks a lot, Cathy. This is very interesting. You mentioned some of the trends, and actually what you said matches some of the things that Priya and Cassio said earlier, and the things that we see in Russia, actually, especially with specific SDGs that companies and NGOs emphasize a lot. The SDGs you mentioned as top priorities for companies. I'm pretty sure that Priya and Cassio would agree that the same SDGs are very popular in India, Brazil. Those are among the top priorities for companies. And you said 95% of the companies, according to your latest study, said they were aware of SDGs and take them into account in their operations. Because as far as I can remember, when I studied your handbook 3 or 4 years ago, it was much lower, right? I can't remember the exact figure what it was, but I think that 95% is real progress, real improvement. So we can only envy the situation in South Africa and your awareness levels. And actually, this confirms the main conclusion of our review, that little by little, slowly but steadily, awareness level keeps on growing. All right, I want to turn to our last speaker today, Yurii Blagov. Mr. Blagov, you know that SDGs are not just elitist agenda for business and NGOs so they can present their activities draped in SDGs. This is also a very practical tool that you can use for working with other stakeholders. So could you please tell us why you think SDGs can be very helpful?
Thank you very much, Daria, for your question. And I would like to compliment you on excellent moderating of this session. Indeed, this is a conversation and not just a set of presentations. I would like to allow myself to take a broader look at what you've asked me about based on the discussion that has already taken place. As I was listening to my colleagues speaking today, I noted for myself that there's a lot of common between our nations in terms of our attitude towards SDGs and in terms of companies' attitude to SDGs, and also in terms of how philanthropy and charity sector development. And I would like to set up an argument regarding how companies treat SDGs, because somebody said here that many companies, in a lot of cases, in most cases, look at SDGs not as some new areas of their activities, including in the area of charity, but also, but rather they want to adjust SDGs to the focus areas that the companies already have as part of their strategic development agenda internally. I wouldn't look at this negatively or only negatively. If we look at the experience of Russian companies, primarily large and medium Russian enterprises that usually have long-term charity programs associated with the development of the regions where they operate, this is not something new that the Russian companies have invented. This is a legacy of the Soviet enterprises, where such large companies were responsible for the areas where they operated. This tradition continues. This is now a tradition of the business community, but in reality, these companies still responsible for the well-being of people in the areas where they operate. And these are usually long-term charitable programs in a number of focus areas. They understand, the companies understand, that if these goals they have are aligned with the SDGs, they don't just label their activities with the reports and with the SDGs. This gives legitimacy to these activities. And it is important for the companies to understand that the community, that the civil society understands what they're doing. And that is an impetus for them to continue these projects. And they're not just related to today's conjecture. Rather, it is something that makes them a participant of the global agenda. I agree with you, colleagues. I don't think this is a negative trend. I think this is a complement, a supplement, an extra pillar, if you will. Another important point I wanted to bring up in that connection is that we have a lot of things in common with South Africa, for example. I would say 80% of what you've spoken about, Cathy, meets what we have. When you mentioned the number of 95% that are targeting the SDGs, I also remembered about a number from the previous corporate charity forum. Another number that we mentioned there was 95% of companies that align their activities with SDGs too. And back to your question, Daria, and sorry for this long-winded answer to your question, I would like to say that SDGs is not just about giving legitimacy to what we do. It is the foundation for cooperation between large companies, between non-profit organizations and companies. It is a foundation for cooperation between various sectors and industries, because for large companies, this is an important element. In Russia, the discussion that is ongoing is quite acute. And we are now in the mode of the so-called special military operation. We need to be cognizant of the events that we are surrounded by, and we need to keep this in mind, no matter how we identify our agenda, SDG or something like that. We need to put this in the box and put the bags on the shelf and then go back to this agenda as soon as the best times are back. But as a recent survey has shown, and as my experience talking to companies has shown, the companies are not saying no to this agenda. And we see that on the government level, the Russian Federation is still expending a lot of effort on working to achieve the zero hunger goal and the climate agenda. The companies continue to do this. Another thing that happens with larger companies is that they are not involved in charitable activities that are not related to their own strategic goals. They want to align what they do with the value they bring to society. And that gives this activity certain gravity, makes it sustainable. And this is something that requires companies to develop partnerships, because it is through partnerships that companies can reduce their costs associated with their focus on SDGs and spread these costs amongst each other, and that allows them to move forward. I would like to mention social entrepreneurship, which is quite important, and it has been developing at a rapid pace over the recent years. Social entrepreneurship is one of the phenomena of business development. It is associated with the ethical concepts and principles. But let me add one more thing to this. Social entrepreneurship, as I see it, is a individual case of contemporary attitude of the business community to the climate, society, and nature. Social entrepreneurs, they go deep into the essence of the social problems, and they do this even in a more profound way that the businesses per se do. And they cannot do this without the support of the society, of the government, and the support of larger companies. This support can come in very different forms: financial, educational support, mentorship support. And we can see here a space where larger businesses, social entrepreneurs, and nonprofits can unite and coordinate their efforts. 7 years ago, or 5 years ago, major Russian companies that were working on social support for the regions of their presence, they try to address this through their own charity programs or through their partnerships with nonprofit organizations. But over the recent years, in addition to these approaches, larger companies are increasingly supporting social entrepreneurship, because for larger companies, this is cheaper. And from the standpoint of sustainability for society, it's more effective. Please understand me properly. I am a teacher from a business school. That's why my brain works in such a way that I constantly try to find an interesting part for business that is not just associated with ethics or the moral component. And the Russian businesses have demonstrated that they can participate in achieving sustainable development goals, even if this participation is associated with long-existed programs, while working on solving their own problems and the problems of the society. That, in broad brushstrokes, that I would like to say in response to your question, This has been a very interesting discussion, and almost on every topic that my colleagues have spoken about, one could respond in terms of how many similarities we have. Thank you very much, Yurii. And I'm sorry, one last thing I wanted to mention, back to the speech by Cathy. You have taken it out of my tongue. I wanted to say very similar things to what you said. When we talked about sustainable development goals, our companies are targeting SDGs as some beacons where we can interact with society and nature, which is good by itself. But when we ask companies to go deeper, to go from the level of the SDGs to the level of tasks and indicators, in many cases, this brings up a lot of questions. This is the level they very rarely go to. And I would like to defend companies in this case. The deeper we go to the level of UN indicators, the less we're going to take into account our specifics, national specifics, and the specifics of the problems that we have in our respective countries. Because if we look at problems associated with hunger, healthcare, and so on, as the general thrust of the UN SDGs, we are looking at the general problems of hunger, healthcare, and so on within our countries and within our regions. But when we look at the global level, our heads start to spin. We are starting to think, how can what we do help liquidate hunger in remote areas? And for many companies, this is a reason to say, this program is not for us. Because with all due respect, when we talk about problems of Equatorial Africa, we are not involved in this. This is too far remote from us. So as a professor, I repeat myself, and I'm sorry for that. When we participate in SDGs, even if we write down what we need to achieve, this is very useful by itself. And we need to be very cognizant of this value. Thank you very much. Thank you, Yurii. I am always inspired by your presentations and speeches. It seems to me, in drawing conclusions based on our discussions, that I would agree with many of the things that you've said. Having listened to our distinguished colleagues, I would like to say that at some point during the discussion, we could arrive at the conclusion that for many goals and indicators, we may not be moving forward. In fact, in some cases, we may have setbacks, plus there are international crises and foreign policy crises that are getting in the way. And we get the impression that there are always impediments to getting at least a little bit closer to achieving the SDGs. And there is nothing that helps us. That's the semblance that I'm getting. And so based on that, I would like to say that we shouldn't be looking at the issue from that perspective. Maybe we are not moving towards the SDG goals at the same pace we would like to move towards that goal. We've been doing this for 10 years. We've been working actively to achieve those goals, but it is true we are quite behind. Many stakeholders are just becoming conscious and cognizant of the issues at hand. But nevertheless, SDGs could be used as a goal that can never be achieved. We can use the SDGs in order to interact with each other here and now. If we keep in mind that every big journey starts with the first step, we can say the same about what we do. If we could just keep holding that major goal in our heads, we will not be making the first steps. But we have here stakeholders from very different countries, and they would have never gotten together had it not been for the SDGs. Some non-commercial, non-profit organizations are using SDGs in order to use this track in order to get to a business level people would want to cooperate with. And in many cases, SDGs could become a common language to ensure that we have proper communication between the governments and civil societies. And hopefully this is something that's going to happen very soon. If we don't look back at the SDGs inattainability and instead try to do the best we can where we are with what we have, then maybe we will focus on this value of the SDGs. So we know these 17 goals and 169 indicators. Maybe if we keep that in mind, maybe we'll not get to this city on the hill by 2030, but at least it will push us forward in our progress compared to where we would be had it not been for the millennial goals and the other goals that followed, the SDGs. On this note, I would rather be more optimistic than pessimistic, and I think that we are quite thankful to our foreign colleagues to joining us from the various points on the map where they are. Sometimes their times are not very good, but that is an indication that we have things to work on, and we could use the SDGs as a goal and as the language we could use together in order to move towards this common goal. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, and in a few moments we will move on to the next session of our Forum's program. Thank you.